from Pennsylvania. I was meant to be in Pennsylvania in March, and that didn't quite work out. I was going to be travelling between different Frederick Douglass institutes, giving talks about Douglass in Britain and other things. The talk I'm going to give is an undergraduate talk, but I'd wanted, just before giving it, just to talk about what's been happening here recently, because the international dimensions of Black Lives Matter have been really exciting. So that, for instance, about within a week of George Floyd's death, we had an amazing socially distanced demonstration with 250 to 300 people in the big town square in Lancaster. And the exciting thing was about it was so many young people, and then we followed that up on a weekly basis with socially distanced protests around the city's one-way system, with people taking the knee for 8 minutes 46 seconds at 6 o'clock on a kind of busy commuter time here. And, you know, really making a splash with lots of nice, lots of interactions with motorists, mainly, the odd not such nice interaction, but, you know, just an incredible, and I suppose why I wanted to mention it is just that I'm sure that you've seen these things and know about them, but I've been quite surprised at the level of it here. And the other thing that's happened is, from those meetings, a Lancaster Black History group is setting itself up, with, again, run by young activists, and you know, I'm going to be advising them and that kind of thing. So that's really exciting. And in the meantime, I've been developing a new Lancaster slave trade abolition trial, and the important thing about that is that there's lots more Black agency now. We've got lots of escaped slaves, abolitionist meetings, so that we've developed that. And the final thing to tell you about is that in June, we were meant to open the Labaina Hamid Memorial to Zong exhibition at the Lancaster Maritime Museum. Labaina Hamid is my colleague, and she's also a Turner Prize winner. So, and she had a 1991 group of works about the Zong incident called Memorial to Zong, and we had the idea to have an exhibition of those in a port city like Lancaster, which had been a slave trade port. And she's lent all the works. I was going to put in some works I own as well, which are about Lancaster, so a dinner service which Labaina had worked on, and made some very interesting caricatures which were in her Turner Prize show. And just unfortunately, COVID has postponed it, but we're hopefully going to have it. But I've got 300 of these published, so I'm going to give you one of each of these for the different Frederick Douglass institutes. So I'll either post them in the autumn or deliver them to you yourself. It's a beautiful catalogue, and essays by myself and a historian and an art historian, with all of the different artworks pictured. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll share my screen with you, and then I'll give the lecture. Tell me when you can see it, someone.
We can.
Great. So today I'm just going to be talking about 18th century formations, really the formation of race in a sense, and the way that happens through colonialism. So I'm going to try and talk about the following: racism and the Enlightenment, the visual record, the philosophers speak, that is, great men belittle themselves, Subaltern speaks, Francis Williams, Phyllis Wheatley, Orlando Equiano, and in a once only in this lecture, because I lecture about him usually somewhere else, I'm bringing in Robert Wedderburn, because I know Maria's class has been speaking about him. He's a exceptionally important British black radical, late 18th, early 19th century black radical, who often gets overlooked, especially in many Americans haven't really ever heard of him. And I just think he's stunning. And you'll find out why later. Okay, so start with this illustration of Phyllis Wheatley, and slave servant to John Wheatley of Boston, and her very important book of poems, 1773. And what I wanted to stress was that book of poems wasn't just sent to a publisher by her and her master and then published. That book of poetry had to be very interesting. You can read about this in Henry Louis Gates's Loose Cannons. There had to be a committee of the great and the good in Boston. And what they were authenticating was that she herself had written this book, because the idea was that that this was just a kind of lie, because a black woman couldn't have written this book, couldn't have written these poems, because she wouldn't have the mental capacity to. And so she had to go before that strange group of Boston worthies and prove her ability to write this. And she proved it by not only proving her ability to write and speak in English, but also proving her ability to write and speak in Latin. So, and that's kind of the kind of background to this lecture, in a sense. It's just for you to have this kind of strange occurrence in your head as a means of thinking about writing being so important as a means of talking about humanity. And then the next illustration is of the Wedgwood medallion. Wedgwood's medallions are really kind of quintessential anti-slavery emblem. Am I not a man and a brother? And they also made some of these with Am I not a woman and a sister? And abolitionist women in particular would wear these as ceramic badges. And of course, there's a gigantic problem with this image. There was a problem then, and there's a problem now. Here is a black man in chains begging for his freedom. And of course, that's that kind of demeaning image is an image which undermines the kind of idea that actually obviously it was black men themselves and women who fought for their abolition across the British Empire and in the Americas. So what you've I'm getting you to understand really is, in this lecture at least, is that there's a tremendous interest in Africans for their bodies and not for their minds in lots of ways. And there's a way of science is becoming something which is looking at differentiation between bodies in terms of different races, and often using that to kind of construct new kind of racial ideas. And this picture, which is ironically made in the year that the slave trade was abolished in Britain, is one of these kind of scientific men gathering round an artist developing a picture, a portrait of a black man as a means of understanding his difference to the superior race. And this kind of scientific, I'm using that word obviously in scare quotes, scientific endeavour happened a lot in the late 18th and early 19th century. And Sada Bartman, the Hottentot Venus, as she became known, was bought from South Africa to Europe, and in her bringing across, her body shape became a tremendous of tremendous interest, both in kind of a disgraceful open show of her, which happened in London and in Paris, indeed, and a kind of scientism where people investigated this as a means of thinking about different racial types. And eventually, when she died, the bits of her body were kept in museums in Paris, as you know, as a means of sort of thinking about, this is a scientific object to be analysed, and they were still there right up until the late 20th century. So the ways in which 18th and early 19th century Enlightenment thought developed was to sort of think about a kind of gradation of people, of men, and of the whole of nature, in fact. And this is one of the kind of differentiations. So if you look at the bottom, it goes from Grecian antique. It's almost as though the idea is basically that we have a kind of development of human beings to their kind of peak, which is in the kind of Roman Grecian kind of world, which leads us to the Europeans directly. And then we have a gradation which goes downwards from God. God, of course, is above all, and then the European man comes, and then Native Americans, Asiatics, and then at the bottom are the Africans. And these kind of pseudoscience of this develops, which actually kind of describes literally the ways in which bodies are shown to be superior or inferior. And one of these ideas is that actually that the African is closer to the apes. That in fact that is where there is synergy. The synergy is there, and this disgraceful idea gets developed. And the problem is that it's not developed, like if we start talking about this now in the 21st century, everyone thinks that this is a kind of racist trope, and the people that develop it are, racists at the bottom of society, In fact, in the 18th century and in the 17th century before, there is a kind of tremendous energy behind the idea of the similarity between Africans and the animal kingdom. And so it's all over caricatures. And these caricatures help to frame the racist world in which we live. So I want to show to an extent how early some of this thought is, and how steeped it is in some of the great thinkers. And again, you might want to put that in square quotes, of the right from the earliest times, sort of pre-Enlightenment thinkers who seep into the Enlightenment, like Sir Francis Bacon. Let a man only consider what a difference there is between the life of men in the most civilized province of Europe and the wildest and most barbarous districts of New India. You feel it to be great enough to satisfy the saying that man is God to man. And again, Peter Heylin, 1631, black Africans lack completely, he says, the use of reason, which is peculiar unto man. They're of little wit and destitute of all arts and sciences, prone to luxury, and for the greatest part idolaters. That is, they don't believe in God. So this kind of whole idea that reason is something that white people have is hardwired from an early stage of the development of thought in the Enlightenment. And of course, so that when the Americans, when the British are colonizing America, their idea really is that actually the tools of education are not for black people, and they're not for enslaved Africans. They're not even really for free Africans. And the South Carolina Statute of 1714 is, along with slave codes throughout the American South, is a way of instituting that into law, of a way of saying that the work of the mind, the work of thinking, is not for Africans, the enslaved Africans. And whereas the having of slaves taught to write or suffering them to be employed in writing may be attending with great inconveniences, be it enacted that all and every person and persons whatsoever who shall hereafter teach or cause any slave or slaves to be taught to write, or shall use or employ any slave as scribe, shall for every offence forfeit the sum of £100. £100 is, thousands of pounds in those days of money, or thousands of dollars in American. And it just shows the kind of the ways in which these modes of thinking about who is able to do these things is not just at the level of, thinkers saying, oh, black people don't have the capacity and the means, their brains aren't of the same kind. Actually, that is enshrined in laws, and these laws and codes go throughout the British Empire and the Spanish Empire and the Portuguese Empire, so that the teaching of slaves is something which is frowned upon across different slave plantation polities. Okay, so these are some of the great men of the Enlightenment, and this is David Hume. When I was at Edinburgh University, I did English and history in the 1980s, and the tower where I did all my work was called the David Hume Tower. It's 14 stories high, beautiful English library on about the 12th floor. The building wasn't beautiful, it was a 1960s monstrosity, and they'd knocked down a beautiful Georgian square to build it. It's just a disgrace. But that's Edinburgh University for you. Hume himself, the tower was named after him because he's one of the prime Enlightenment thinkers, and of course he was an Edinburgh thinker. He lived in Edinburgh, and at this time in the mid and late 18th century, Edinburgh is one of the prime places in the world for Enlightenment thinking. So 1748, he writes in Of National Characters, all the other species of men to be naturally are inferior to the whites. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white, nor any individual eminent either in action or speculation. There are Negro men slaves dispersed all over Europe, of which none ever discovered any symptoms of ingenuity. So this is a really important quotation, partly because of the way he sets it up. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white. And he's of course thinking of the Romans, the Greeks, and now modern civilization. And he doesn't see beyond that geography. He's ignorant beyond that geography. He thinks people have been to other geographies. They've been to America now. What did they find there? They found what they would call savages. The same in Africa. In Asia, they find what they think of as inferior people as well. They can't see those folks' civilizations under their very noses. They can't understand because they have an ethnocentricity which doesn't allow them to see them. The second part of this is even more interesting though, in a sense, because it speaks to a growing but very small at this time, Negro population, African population in Britain and in Europe. And these people, you know, they've come into contact with white people now. So surely, in this view, they should have developed. And he says that they're basically none of them show any symptoms of ingenuity. There's no intelligence going on there, according to David Hume. Now, I'd like to kind of contrast this kind of idea David Hume has of these inert slave servants who are just dressed in collars at this time. Collars have the names of their owners on them, and who are just kind of doing the biddings of their owners and quite content not to be involved in anything else very much other than being servants. And of course, you know, the narrative is that they're very well looked after, very well clothed, because sometimes they are very well clothed, because that's the way these slave owners have of showing their wealth. So I would like to contrast that, and this is a slight interlude with something that's been discovered recently, and which you can all look up, which is there's now a website developed by a project in Glasgow called Runaway Slaves in England. And it has documented all the 846, I think, the 846 slave runaway advertisements in Britain. And who is civilized and who is uncivilized? Let us look at one of those slave runaway advertisements. I don't have it on the screen because I didn't know I was going to talk about this. It is for an Igbo boy. An Igbo boy who has escaped, who's run away. This Igbo boy doesn't seem to have a name. He's not been baptized. This is really rather surprising. His master is the Reverend Thomas Clarkson of Heysham, near Lancaster. He's the same name as a very famous abolitionist, but this man is totally different. If you go into his church today, there are shrines to this guy. He was the clergyman there who took that church to a new place. Until 2 years ago, we didn't know he owned an African boy. This Igbo boy has African scarification marks on his face. It means he was almost certainly born in the Igbo country of Nigeria. It goes through, it says he has a lump on his forehead. We know who gave him that lump. It goes through, it talks about his clothing, and it says he walks with a limp. We know that almost certainly the limp was caused by his poor treatment at the hands of the Reverend Thomas Clarkson. And the final line has this: he speaks with broad Lancashire dialect. The reason they put that there is because he's almost certainly escaping to London, where there's a larger black population, probably 4,000 or 5,000 people at this time. And his scarification marks might not get him, but what would get him would be a black man speaking with a Lancashire dialect. Anyway, we think that he was never recaptured. We've got no other details about his life, but we don't have him returning to the Reverend Thomas Clarkson, thank the Lord. None ever discovered any symptoms of ingenuity. I think this boy, Igbo boy, discovered some great symptoms of ingenuity. Firstly, in terms of his interaction with the locals, which enabled him, obviously, to blend into them, with them, and then enabled him to escape. So David Hume, wrong on all counts. He says, in Jamaica, indeed, they talk of one Negro as a man of parts and learning, but 'tis likely is admired for very slender accomplishment, like a parrot who speaks a few words plainly. So this is a very common trope when talking about enslaved Africans, when talking about Africans. is that yes, sure, they can copy us, but they can't actually kind of they're not capable of making up their own stuff, making up their own poetry. So that Francis Williams, as a poet, has to be demeaned, has to be said about him that he's not a poet, he's just a plagiarist. He just copies what white people do and tell him to do. And this is a portrait of Williams. Okay, so if we go forward to Immanuel Kant, one of the most important of the Enlightenment thinkers. So these are obviously translations from the German. And, you know, what a great title, Observations on of the Feeling of the Beautiful and the Sublime. You know, he's trying to get to that moment of pure philosophy where we can just talk about beauty and, you know, how wonderful things are. But, you know, this is maybe a moment when you start thinking about Toni Morrison and her book Playing in the Dark, and the way in which she talks about whiteness becoming white only in terms of demeaning the African. So he talks about, so fundamental is the difference between the races of men, it appears to be as great in regards to mental capacities as in colour. And then we have to be very careful here, but the next quotation, in trying to call enslaved Africans and Africans in general ignorant, Kant just shows up his own ignorance. He talks about, this fellow was quite black from head to foot, a clear proof that what he said was stupid. So Kant would ask for, if he had a student in front of him, he'd ask for a whole range of ways of proving his point, and one wouldn't be just by a declaration. And then Americans, Indians and blacks are lower in their mental capacities than all other races. Okay, so again, this is not just some, you know, fly kind of political propagandist, you know, this is an Enlightenment thinker. These are Enlightenment thinkers. They are constructing the world of thought which people are going to live under, and which in a sense we still live under today. And they have strength right through them a racism which needs to be challenged. And it needs to be challenged actually because people still defend these thinkers. And when they teach them, they either avoid these thoughts, or they talk about these thoughts as just being, well, that's, you know, kind of the general feeling then, so we should just, you know, let's quickly go past this thing. Well, no, we can't go past this thing. This thing undermines the way in which we should look at the Enlightenment as a paradigm we should follow. We shouldn't follow this paradigm in large part, because of the racialism which underpins it. So Henry Louis Gates in his study Loose Cannons talks about, ironically, Anglo-African writing arose as a response to allegations of its absence. You know, so that in fact they're kind of, these thinkers are saying, oh, there's not the capacity for writing. Blacks can't do this, enslaved Africans can't do this, Africans can't do this. You know, they don't have the capabilities. So if you're told that, and you're a slave who's bought his, enslaved African who's bought his freedom, or enslaved African who's been freed by his master, or an enslaved African who has escaped, one of the first things you're going to be wanting to do is to show that this idea of black people being unable to write is just arrant nonsense. Black people being unable to think. So this is 1773, and Phyllis Wheatley's poems on various subjects, religious and moral, which was published in London. And here's a poem on being brought from Africa to America. And uh, it's a really important poem in terms of uh, Black, British and American letters. It's one of the first poems written by an African woman, first published poems written by an African woman, and an African American woman, or a Black British woman, depending. I expect he called her African American, born in Boston, but published in London at the time when they were British colonies. I think we'll both give her African American. And the Americans keep trying to steal Equiano from us British, but I think you can. I think he wanted to be called a British gentleman, Equiano. I expect that Phyllis Whitley saw herself as being British and then American. British when she was, and then after 1776, American. 'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught me my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Saviour too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye, their colour is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train. This is quite a radical poem in lots of ways. It's talking about the fact that blacks can be in heaven just the same as whites. And there's problematics with the poem as well. The ways, it's Christianity brought her from the pagan land. It brought her as a slave. There's a sense in which Christianity is being absolved a little bit here in this poem. Quite interesting. And when you think about the Reverend Thomas Clarkson, you think about the Christians who got, the Anglican Church got £1 million in compensation for all the enslaved Africans they owned in the British Empire. That is £2 billion in today's money. $2.5 billion went directly to the Anglican Church in compensation. The enslaved Africans got no compensation. The slave owners got 20 million. British people were still paying back that debt up until 2015. Thousands and thousands of British people got rich, not only on slavery, but then on the compensation they got. Sorry, Anyway, let's move on from Britain and let's move to Thomas Jefferson. And I'm not going to give you an introduction to Thomas Jefferson because you're all going to tell me much more about him than I'll ever know, just from his importance in American history, etc. I've done some work on notes on the state of Virginia, and those notes show a racism at the core and heart of his being, which obviously is shown as well by his status as a slave owner. Never yet, he says, could I find a black man had uttered a thought above the level of plain narration, never seen an elementary trait of painting or sculpture. And you might well say, well, Thomas, you didn't really give your people much of an ability to get out there, do plain narration, painting or sculpture. They were too busy working in your fields, or you were too busy. It's well known that he had black mistresses, that in fact, he saw them as sexual playthings or workers. He did not see them as anything more than that. And he talks about how women, black enslaved women, in their own judgment, and Africans in general, in favour of the whites, declared by their preference of them as uniformly is the preference of the orangutan for the black woman over those of his own species. What he's talking about there is just sheer racism. It's the fact that there is interrelations between blacks and apes. And, this is an Enlightenment thinker. It's someone who wrote the Declaration of Independence, and look at the level of idiocy in his thought. And some people might at this stage say, well, lots of people thought this at the time. Well, by the 1770s and 1780s, there were many enlightened white people who were thinking very differently and writing very differently. The shame is that most of the Enlightenment thinkers will have passages like this. And then talking about Wheatley and other poets, among the blacks is misery enough, God knows, but no poetry. Religion indeed has produced a Phyllis Wheatley, but it could not produce a poet. The compositions published under her name are below the dignity of criticism. So he's here basically saying that Phyllis Wheatley's poetry is doggerel. Well, I would urge him to actually look at a much 18th century poetry, and she would come in pretty well in comparison to many white poets. I'm not going to make value judgments, but he knows very little about it. But also, there is a sense in which, in terms of form, her poems really work, and they work well, as we saw earlier. And what he's doing here, he's denying being a poet because he wants to keep Black Americans in their place. So, you know, and he's saying that there's no poetry amongst them. That, in fact, you know, and that's best really, because that's how they deserve to be. That's all they can be in that place without poetry. Okay, so I wanted to end on a much more positive note, and Alardo Equiano, and I wanted to end with him because, in a sense, he answers these Enlightenment thinkers in his own way. I'm not actually going to end on him today because I'm going to talk about Robert Wedderburn, because also I think it's really important when we talk about Black thinkers and writers that we don't utterly canonize them. They all make ideological mistakes and other kinds of mistakes. And Equiano wanted to be an English gentleman, and as someone who spends lots of my time fighting politically against English gentlemen, I find that quite a strange desire, really. But anyway, we'll talk about that as we go on, because we'll compare him to Robert Wedderburn. But in this book, Interesting Life, Narrative of the Life of Alardo Equiano and Gustavus Vassa the African, published originally in 1789, so this is a later edition from 1793. We see Equiano here, and he's holding the Bible. He's showing us that he's an Enlightenment man who can read and write. He was the first Black British man to leave a will. His writing and his other enterprises led to him having enough money to leave a will. He married a white woman, and she and her daughters are buried in East Anglia, and there is just this. There is this is an incredible life story. Born a slave in Africa, in the West Indies. He was actually owned by a Quaker merchant, and he made a pact with this Quaker merchant. He said, look, if I was able to earn by the sweat of my brow the £60 that you think I'm worth, will you give me my freedom? And his master, Robert King, said, of course I will, Equiano. I'm a Quaker man, a man of my word. I shake my hand with you. And at the time, Equiano, who Robert King had seen as being a really, really great and very useful and intelligent servant, he set him doing the inter-island trade, and he was King's inter-island trader. And what Equiano did was, I think he found a very tiny bit of money and did his own trading and earned the odd bit of money elsewhere and did his own trading. And he grew a few pennies until 3 years later he had £60. And he went back to Robert King and he said, can I have my freedom now? King was very angry, but gave him his freedom. Then he was a sailor in the British Navy. And then he ended up living in London, was one of the founders of the Sons of Africa. And, just an incredible life story, and then wrote what many see as the first slave narrative. And what I wanted to talk about really was the way in which his work works against these ideas of enlightenment. I had seen a black woman slave as I came through the house who was cooking the dinner, and the poor creature was cruelly loaded with various kinds of iron machines. She had one in particular on her head which locked her mouth so fast she could hardly speak. I was much astonished and shocked at this contrivance, the iron muzzle. So he's discovering these awful things about slavery as he grows up in the system. And one of the ways I see this particular passage is talking back to this idea of white civilization. How can there be a civilization which does this to human beings, treats them like animals? Muzzle is what you do to dogs. And his pictures of different kind of slave punishments. And so that's one of the things he does. And the other thing he does is he kind of comes face to face with technologies. And I'd like to kind of briefly talk about what I think he does with those technologies. He talks about the watch. I indulged myself a great deal in looking about the room, which to me appeared very fine and curious. The first object that engaged my attention was a watch which hung on the chimney and was going. I was quite surprised at the noise it made and was afraid it would tell the gentleman anything I might do amiss. So here he's coming face to face with a technology he doesn't know about. And you might think this is a way of him showing his ignorance. I think this and other instances are ways he has of showing his great wisdom. It is the watch that watches him. It is the watch that times him. It is the watch that reports on him. And getting to know that will enable him to be free. Getting to know the technology will enable him to be free. And getting to know that his world is time defined by the master and the master's time. So Enlightenment thinking has developed, and science has developed these ways of codifying and splitting up time. Time used to be you woke up in the morning, you did your work, you got to dusk and you went to bed. To an extent, there are ways in which plantation time ran a bit like that. But he in the household is going to learn how this watch works and will try to work towards a new kind of time, a time which will give him power. And also, of course, on those plantations, we have to say that increasingly they become factory timed. So that there's ways in which time is an oppressive thing, and it's shown as an oppressive thing here. And when I immediately after observed a picture hanging in the room, which appeared constantly to look at me, you've got to remember he's come from an African context, and portraits aren't things which happen on the walls there. I was still more affrighted, having never seen such things as these before. At one time I thought it was something relative to magic. Not seeing it move, I thought it might be some way the whites had to keep their great men when they died. I thought these men were all made up of wonders. Again, this seeming, lack of knowledge. And yet, to an extent, he knows more. These whites did have these ways of keeping their great men when they died. It's their way of keeping their history. It's their way of saying this genealogy is the right genealogy. It's the genealogy which enshrined slavery. So my father was a slave owner. His father was a slave owner. We are in charge here. And this portrait that looks like it's looking at you, it probably is. In a sense, it is. It's looking at you and keeping you in your place, just as we do today. So then he sets to reading. I had often seen my master and Dick employed in reading, and I had a great curiosity to talk to the books as I thought they did, and so to learn how all things had a beginning. For that purpose I have often taken up a book and have talked to it, then put my ears to it when alone in hopes it would answer me, and I have been very much concerned when I found it remained silent. Well, yeah, naivety again. He thinks books talk to him. It's not naivety. Books do talk to him. Books construct him. It is through reading that he learns to be free. It isn't silent anymore. He learns the technology of the book. He learns that the book can talk through him. And when he publishes his book, he has created his own talking book, a book that talks to hundreds of thousands and which will lead, with many other books, to abolition. So he learns the technologies the white people have. He learns those Enlightenment modes and turns them back, turns the trick back. What an amazing man. And then there's the folk belief. Many merchants and planters now came on board. Though it was in the evening, they put us in separate parcels and examined us attentively. They also made us jump and pointed to the land, signifying we were to go there. We thought by this we should be eaten by these ugly men as they appeared to us. We thought by this we should be eaten by these ugly men as they appeared to us. What a silly belief. What a silly kind of heathen idea. What, these men are going to eat us? That's just so stupid. Or is it? What actually happens in slavery? In slavery, 12 million African bodies are consumed by Western economies. Countless millions later, their descendants are consumed by Western economies. Some of them are literally consumed in the slave ships and thrown overboard to the sharks. They are literally consumed in order to make profits for these ugly men. Yes. So that folk beliefs in cannibalism in Africa, in white cannibalism, Equiano's talking of these here actually talk to a reality much, much more than European beliefs of Native American cannibalism or African cannibalism, which actually did not consume millions of white people, as the slave trade was to later, even if only, and I'm saying only in very big square quotes, only metaphorically and symbolically. Okay, so yeah, he's all our heroes, is Equiano, but I think I wanted to share with you, as a means of talking about Robert Wedderburn, ways in which Equiano is quite a bourgeois thinker and pretty much in the establishment in Britain in terms of this. He actually becomes quite a rich man, and he's very much a monarchist. And may the all be bountiful creator shower on your majesty and the royal family every blessing that this world can afford, and every fullness of joy which divine revelation has promised us in the next. I am your majesty's most dutiful and devoted servant to command. So at this time, this is 1788, there's massive kind of, in Britain, a massive kind of push towards more rights for working men. Equiano's sort of connected to some of the people involved in that, but he's straddling his horses. He knows the person who can let his people be free is the Queen, and so this is a letter by him and the Sons of Africa imploring her to free him. And in order to do that, I think he toadies to the Queen in ways that I'm not too happy with, especially in comparison to this amazing man who is my absolute hero, Robert Wedderburn, who was born free in Jamaica and then moved to London. He was also a sailor in the Royal Navy, involved in revolts against the brutality in the naval ships, and they ended up in London and became a printer, a lay preacher, and what a proto-anarchist you'd have to call him. So these are what he thought of the monarchy. And so this is 2 months after the Peterloo massacre in Manchester, where about 20, where the militia attacked a peaceful meeting and killed about 20 men, women and children under the hooves and by the sabres of government militia troops. He says at this public meeting, the prince has lost the confidence and affection of his people, but that the prince, being supported by the army and surrounded by his vile ministers, nothing short of the people's taking arms in their own defence, could bring about a reform and prevent the same bloody scene taking place here in London as took place in Manchester. So that Wedderburn thinks we should have a national uprising against the monarchy and a revolution. And also, many abolitionists were part of the Anglican Church, part of churches in general. And he, as I say, was a lay preacher, but he had a great deal of difficulty kind of navigating his Spencean beliefs, his beliefs which were Christian, but were all about the equality of men, with some of the ways in which the Anglicans talked about Jesus Christ. I just wanted to share this with you because I think it just shows you how radical people could be then. They tell us to be quiet like that bloody spoony Jesus Christ, who like a bloody fool tells us when we get a slap on one side of the face, turn gently round and ask them to smack the other. But I, like jolly old Peter, give me a rusty sword, for as they have declared war against the people and the Prince Regent has sanctioned it, we must redress our own grievances. Glory be to Thomas Paine. So that, in a sense, yes, we need to respond to those Enlightenment ways and modes of thinking about race. But in doing so, there are many different ways to think as a black man and as a radical. And I think it's great that we have Olaudah Equiano, but I think it's great we have Robert Wedderburn as well, and Phyllis Wheatley and Francis Williams. And one of the worst things we can do is to put them all in the same box. These people have responded to those Enlightenment thinkers in very different ways, created very different black realities, and we really need to think about that in whenever we come to talk about them, that yes, we need to fight against that racism which has been established by the Enlightenment, which continues down to our own day. But we should have a plurality of voices. We should never get into that problematic where we tell everyone to think the same things. Thank you very much.